Various changes occurred during the Gilded Age, but almost all can be traced back to one booming aspect that influenced every part: immigration. It was recorded that about 11.7 million immigrants arrived in the U.S. during this time period. Each group had reasons for coming, be it from religious persecution, hope for a better life, or escaping any form of hardships. During this time period between 1871 and 1901, immigration was classified into two main groups: old and new. European immigrants arrived in hopes for a more prosperous way of life. The Irish were in the midst of a potato blight or famine, and many in the country were unemployed. To escape these hardships, they arrived in the United States. Immigrants from Germany, England, and Scandinavia also joined the great flock migrating toward the U.S. Lack of numerous available jobs was a frequent trouble faced by the arrivals. These immigrants settled on the frontier, which in that point in time was still open. They helped build the railroads and canals, which were essential to America's economic success. These jobs, during the old period, were particularly dangerous, but few immigrants had a choice. Compared to their experiences in their native country, America seemed to be the perfect land of opportunity. Life in America may have seemed very appealing to the foreign immigrant, but Americans were not pleased at all. Nativism was rapidly taking hold in the United States. This theory believed that immigrants had no place in the U.S. and that the only ones who belonged there were the ones who had been there long before, the ones who had had families there for generations. The nativists formed the American Party, which later became known as the Know-Nothing Party. The Know-Nothing Party, established in 1849, loathed the idea of new immigration. They believed that all the immigrants flocking into the United States took jobs away from the good, hard-working American people. But the Know-Nothing Party did not last. Millard Fillmore of the Know-Nothing Party ran for president and lost the election of 1856. In 1860, the Know-Nothing Party fell apart, separating for good. After the flood of old immigration, a wave of new immigration began to set in. From 1880 to 1890, Europeans from Greece, Italy, Poland, Hungary, Austria, and Russia entered. Austrians and Russians fled taxation and military duty, while Jewish immigrants escaped from persecution and war.
During this time, overcrowding in the cities led to very unsafe living conditions, with large amounts of people living in cramped buildings. In 1890, the federal government finally took action against this and began to regulate immigration instead of the previous policy where states controlled the immigration. In 1892, they created Ellis Island, located in New York. First and second class traveling immigrants could simply bypass the island, but third class traveling immigrants were required to stop and undergo inspection. Often, only 2% of the immigrants who arrived were turned away. The western frontier, which had closed by this point, left little option for the new immigrants. This forced them to settle into the already overcrowded and unsanitary cities. The most popular of these cities were Chicago, New York, and Boston. There, the agriculturally challenged found jobs that were easy and plenty, factory jobs. The immigrants received very little education, and because of this were often difficult to assimilate into America. The extreme overcrowding led to the development of ghettos, which were, more often than not, families and friends would be cramped together for space. Many Irish immigrants lived in tenements, one small housing allotted per family with no running water, making it impossible to maintain good hygiene. Disease was common, and lack of proper health materials did not help the new immigrants' situation. In 1882, yet another obstacle entered the path of the immigrants, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Immigrants feared that the Chinese would take everything from the struggling American, a fear which later became known as the Yellow Peril. Worry crept through the Chinese immigrants worked for too little, for too long, and that they would take available jobs, leaving Americans penniless. Then, in 1892, Congress made a law barring Chinese immigration, later cementing it in 1902. This act made it illegal for a Chinese person to enter the U.S. and become an American. The act continued until 1943, when China became an ally of war and peace was essential. During this time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese were brutally attacked, beaten, imprisoned, and treated as inferior to Americans. Slogans such as starvation or disgrace were adopted to further humiliate the Chinese immigrants. On the western coast, another immigration center was created. Angel Island, as it was known, was founded in 1905 and was mainly used to process Asian immigrants. Located in the San Francisco Bay, it was not only a process island, but a detention center as well. Chinese and Japanese immigrants were held there for long periods of time, undergoing heavy questioning and scrutinizing. To the Asian immigrant, it was the equivalent of a prison. Angel Island, ironically named, also followed the Chinese and Japanese Restriction Acts. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't the only policy adopted to restrict immigration. The National Origins Acts of 1924 and 1929, after World War I, restricted immigration from certain nationalities. Asians as well as immigrants from the southern eastern part of Europe were restricted, almost barred, from entering the U.S. The acts allowed only 65,000 immigrants a year, only 20% of the amount allowed before. This policy remained until the 1960s, when it was removed. Immigrants from all over the globe began to gather and hope for a better life. Both J. Hector D. Krakauer of 1782 and Frederick Jackson Turner of 1893 saw in America a new idea, the theory of the melting pot. This theory states that when together, the immigrants' culture, ethnicities, and religious values would combine and mix, hence the term melting pot. This would create a society even better than ever before. In theory, it was a perfect idea. However, studies have shown that while races did join, only 3 religions combined in the melting pot: Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic. The theory itself was mostly geared toward the mixing and forming of all immigrants into the Caucasian culture.
The theory of the American melting pot was part of a section of intermixing. Assimilation, a theory on the pathways immigrants took to conjoin themselves into America, had many different assumptions that made it up. Anglo-conformity was the first of them, an idea that started that because Anglo immigrants were the majority and because so, all minority immigrants adopted their way. Later, the process theory developed, which implied that immigrants were to undergo a series of assimilations and trial sections. It was a long, tedious, and drawn-out task. The process theory was the idea assimilation takes time. That is not just a quick introduction into the country. They would be tried by their experiences in the country, leaving plenty of room for doubt. Besides the melting pot, Anglo-conformity, and the process theory, there was also the segmented labor market. The skills, discrimination, and resources of the immigrations separated them into different labor groups. The elite job section, relying on great potential, contained only a few immigrants. This notion states that there is a very uneven playing field for the immigrants when they enter America. Never able to reach the top, this also hindered their assimilation into the U.S. The last theory of assimilation, multiculturalism, arose just before the Civil Rights Movement. The culture of different ethnicities led America into a rapid expansion of diversity and free expression. This theory of multiculturalism allowed the immigrants to rise up and take their rightful place in the wonderful culture of America.